Welcome to the Wanderers History Podcast. My name is Vlad Zamfira, and today we will discuss about the history of Venetian Cyprus. Nowadays, people know Cyprus as a Mediterranean island, popular tourist destination divided in two parts. One Greek, with the capital at Nicosia, and the Turkish Republic of Cyprus in the north, a republic proclaimed and recognized by the Turks in 1983. With the capital at North Nicosia and Famagusta being the second largest city. Cyprus has a fascinating history, which dates back to thousands of years ago. Back in ancient times, it was said to be the birthplace of gods such as Aphrodite and Adonis. It was ruled by the Egyptians, Alexander the Great, the Byzantine Empire, the French Lusignan dynasty, the Venetian republics, and the Ottomans. So it was a very disputed domain in the eastern Mediterranean, rich in natural resources and close to the Holy Lands. Venice acquired Cyprus in 1489 and annexed it to its Commonwealth. It had previous financial ties to the Venetian Republic as a proxy and trade intermediary, and Cyprus arguably was one of the most valuable, if not the most valuable, Venetian domain. By the 16th century, Cyprus was predominantly Greek Orthodox from an ethnic and socio-economic point of view. It had a flourishing economy, numerous ports, Famagusta being by far the wealthiest and most productive. In Cyprus, you had traders from different parts of the world: Armenians, Turks, Syrians, Florentine, Savoy, Genoese, Jewish, Sicilian, Coptic, and the list goes on. Once Constantinople and Byzantium fell in 1453, the Venetian Republic began to face immediate pressures regarding its Commonwealth, situated extremely close to the Ottoman Empire. By 1570, 3 wars against the Ottomans were lost, and that led to numerous losses for the Venetians, including Thessaloniki, parts of the Morea, and the main Greek lands. By 1570, the geopolitical situation reached a critical point, as the Ottomans were desperate for a new conquest, especially after the crucial defeat at Malta in 1565. Cyprus would be the easiest and most rewarding target, and in order to conquer it, Selim II's army had to conquer northern Cyprus, Nicosia, and Famagusta. The profound disdain of the Cypriot lower classes and peasantry granted the Ottomans free passage in a mostly undefended northern part of Cyprus. Furthermore, Nicosia would be poorly fortified and lacked personnel because of an incompetent and clueless lieutenant called Nicolo Dandolo. The only hope laid in Marcantonio Bragadin, the fort of Famagusta, and aid from the Venetian naval forces led by Girolamo Zane, which of course never came. The following accounts come from a book entitled Excepta Cypria, edited by Claude de Laval Copham in 1908, and it is a documentary history about Cyprus, especially during the times of the Venetians and Ottomans, and it contains precise reports of those who witnessed the terrifying destruction and Ottoman occupation of Cyprus. It also contains reports of what Cyprus was like during the Venetian administration. Before starting to read these accounts, I would like to remind listeners that these were very different times, and by today's standards, one could say that the messages of these letters and documents are racist, chauvinistic, or anti-Semitic. Themes such as slavery in Cyprus are discussed, yet these were the conditions of 16th century Europe, and in this case of Venetian Cyprus, such as described by the likes of Elias of Pesaro, Christopher Furer, and Giovanni Sosomeno. In 1563, one Elias of Pesaro wrote a letter to a friend or family member back to Venice. The letter was dated October 18th and written in Famagusta, eastern Cyprus. He and his family were en route to Syria, where they wished to relocate. However, the region was ravaged by the plague, and thus he and his family were temporarily held up in Cyprus, where Elias reported on Cypriot society under Venetian rule. He began to write, quote, "Famagusta is situated on the seashore. Its area is quite flat. It is a fortified town, girt with a double wall, commanded by a fine, large, and solid castle. It is like Pesaro. The government always keeps here 5 empty galleys to watch and guard the sea, as well as 4 captains living in the town, who have 800 Italian mercenaries under their orders. The townsfolk, who are thus exempt from all military service, are very well behaved and clean, careful to protect themselves from contagion, especially from the plague, which is common enough in the neighboring parts of the Levant. Their precautions are very thorough, as in Italy, and no person arriving from an infected or suspected locality can enter the town before he has been detained 40 days in the harbor. The houses are fine and well built. The roads are well kept up. The products and merchandise of the country are sold in 2 places arranged as markets. Before the royal palace is a large and very pretty square, and at all street corners are fountains of running water. The money current here is in all respects that of Venice. A scudo is worth 10 soldi, a sequin 8 livres, a scudo other than the Venetian 6 livres and 8 soldi. People say that snow has never fallen here, and that there has never been frost. The amount of rain even is very small. On the other hand, the heat is much greater here than in all of the Turkish provinces. In summer, no one leaves his house except for an hour in the morning and an hour in the evening, and the summer lasts 8 months. To go from one place to another, one travels on horseback by night. Such is the custom of persons who wish to preserve their health. For the transport of goods and money, they use great carts drawn by oxen. But the carts are not like ours, no more are the oxen, which are spotted and of many colors. One would think that the patriarch Jacob had fed his herds here. One finds plenty of animals to ride, horses and donkeys. You hire a good horse for 4 livres a day. Forage is cheap. Ophthalmia is very common here. It generally begins on the longest day of the year and lasts beyond the autumn equinox. It begins with a fever, which lasts 2 or 3 days, and violent headaches. Then the fever grows less, and a flux attacks the eyes with pain and inflammation, and lasts for 20 or 30 days. If one is observant and careful, the affection disappears of itself. Men and women, adults and children, are equally liable to it. It must be a result of the heat, for at this moment in mid-October, we cannot bear a sheet over us at night. House rent is about the same as in Italy. I have hired a house composed of 2 large and handsome rooms upstairs, with a kitchen, besides a room below which makes a good kind of store for wine, oil and wood, and a poultry yard, the whole for 10 ducats a year. No one can go and fetch water for himself from the fountain, for the Greeks and crew of the galleys would at once break his pitcher, but the water carriers are constantly coming and going, and bring a barrel to the house for 2 quattrini, quite enough for one's day drinking and cooking. I have seen here a large and fine synagogue supported by a community of 25 families, Levantines, Sicilians, and Portuguese. Hatred, discord, and jealousy reign among them. The only tax that they pay is a sum of 26 ducats sent yearly to the judge of the town for the whole community. They live comfortably without exertion. They have no trades, but live on the interest of their capital, all but 2 or 3 less wealthy, who have not enough ready money to lend, but win a tolerable livelihood as brokers. Throughout the rest of the island, there are no Jews, although it is one of some size and it contains about 15,000 villages, which they call Casali, besides the capital city called Nicosia, 36 miles from Famagusta. People who want to borrow money come here. This money-lending business is really remarkable. One lends to no one except on a thoroughly sound security, no trust or credit. If the pledge is of gold or silver, the interest is 20 per centum. If of wool, thread, or silk, 25 per centum. The pledges is kept a year, after which notice is sent to the debtor at his expense that he must pay in a month at the latest. If when this is passed he does not come, the pledge is taken to the town court and sold by auction. If the price fetched covers the capital, interest, and costs, the borrower takes the balance. If otherwise, the court gives the lender an order on the debtor for the remainder, and he can insist on another pledge to cover that sum. This is no public loan bank, and no lender has any advantage over his fellow. Anyone who wants to follow this business has only to say so, but he is bound to keep a very exact account of the pledges he takes, and get his ledger stamped by the judge. It is then accepted as legal evidence. As soon as the Christians see a fresh Jew arrive to stay here, they ask him if he wants to lend money. If he says yes, they are kindly towards him. They, as in the Cypriots, even beg the newcomer to lend to their friends, whom they cannot oblige themselves. Sometimes sums as great as 50,000 ducats are lent for more than 6 months, but not, of course, to the first comer. It is an essential condition, and a good custom it is, that the borrower, before he receives the loan, were it put but a crown, makes some present in proportion to the sum he asks, a chicken or two, a lamb or goat or calf, some wine, cheese, or oil. But when the pledge represents a large loan, the gift will not be in the same proportion as for small sums, but will be something worth having, equivalent to 3 or 4% additional interest. It is an old custom, without legal basis or authority from the regulations in force, yet better observed than any law, so that you have no occasion to ask for the gift. It is offered to you spontaneously. In 10 days I have lent all the money I brought with me, and all against gold or silver. I would not take clothing in pawn, nor make loans more than 30 scudi or less than 3. Sometimes the brokers ask a considerable sum for commission, so that the borrower pays as much as 40 per centum interest. But nobody cares. In spite of all, the inhabitants are very glad to find ready money for their pledges as they need it. Besides, every mechanic, every laborer, has in his house vessels of silver or jewels, for they are all rich, and pledges are easy to find. I propose now to set forth in detail the advantages and inconveniences of this country, such as I have seen them with my own eyes. The Christians who live in Cyprus, Candia, Corfu, Zante, or Constantinople are mostly Greeks, and are in no wise like Italians. Their intelligence is less developed, their manners are peculiar, and differ from those of all of their fellow Christians. They do not follow the religious laws and ordinance of Roman Christendom, and are not in accord with the Latin races. They have a patriarch at Constantinople who rules them, and to him they go for guidance. Their churches have no bells, and in many other of their customs they differ from the Italians. For instance, on feast days some shops remain open, some are closed, some keep the feast, others work. The Greeks eat meat on the other days of the week as well as Sundays. They keep a Lent 3 times a year, abstaining from all animal products, even from fish and eggs. Their popes marry once, but if that wife dies, they do not take a second. Most of the Greeks are workmen. For all the gold in the world, they would not eat anything that a Jew has touched, and would not ever use his cooking utensils. Suppose a Jew wishes to buy anything from them, he must not touch it, but must describe what he wants. Anything he touches he must keep. They reject, as though it were carrion, the flesh of an animal which has had its throat cut, and hate their Italian fellow Christians, much as we do to the Karaites. They do not allow women to show themselves in the town by day. Only by night they can visit their friends and go to church. They say this is by way of modesty, but it is really to avoid the frequent adulteries, for their rule of life is thoroughly perverse. They are all liars, cheats, thieves. Honesty has vanished from their midst." Unquote. Then follows several paragraphs about the state and quality of food and drinks in Cyprus. At some point Elias returns and, quote, "A man is lucky if he knows medicine, for the Greeks respect the Jews as good doctors and trust them. It is true that they pay in ordinary cases 200 sequins a year for each patient to the Christian doctors, while they give only 120 to Jews, about a Venetian gazzetta a month per patient. These are the common fees, but there are also 2 Jewish doctors, a Portuguese and a Roman, who earn more and make a fine income from their profession. They are held in great respect and wear a black hat with a yellow badge no bigger than the small coin called Isarion, a privilege allowed to no other Jews, who are all obliged to wear, as at Venice, a head covering entirely of yellow. Washing is very dear, twice as dear as we pay in Italy. Shoes are cheap. One can get a good pair with stout soles for 2.5 marcelli. So much for a rapid sketch of the life, manners, and customs of this town. Written at Famagusta, Monday, October 18th, or the new moon of Heswan, in the year of grace 5324, by him who humbly kisses the dust of your feet, who writes here in silence and sends you aloud the blessing of peace." Unquote. The landscape described by Elias is familiar to the European situation of the time. Jews had a difficult situation, especially in Portugal, Spain, France, and large parts of Italy. From his tone, Elias was a staunch Catholic who voiced disdain towards Christian Orthodox Greeks, most likely because of their association with their Ottoman overlords. He observed that Famagusta was by far the best organized and well-defended city in all of Cyprus. But most importantly, he observed the brewing tensions between the Greek majority and Latin minority, which will be even clearer in the accounts of Falchetti and Giovanni Sosomeno. However, I also wish to discuss about the account of German traveler Christopher Furer from Nuremberg. He visited Cyprus between March 29th and May 7th, 1566, 4 years before the Ottoman conquest of Cyprus, and his account was quite revealing. He says, quote, "At first, we rested in a village called Larnica, 2 miles from the port. At no great distance hence is seen the Mount of the Cross, on which they say is preserved the cross upon which hung the penitent thief. On the last day of March we left Larnica at night, for the intolerable heat made travelling by day impossible, and the following morning we entered Famagusta. It was built on a rock, and though not very large, is well fortified, and has a narrow but safe harbour which is closed by chains, and is well suited as an anchorage for light vessels. On the right it has very charming gardens of citrons, pomegranates, and quinces. As in Egypt, the natives draw the water with which they irrigate the land, and which supplies the daily wants of the city, by the joint use of oxen and wheels. The city is distinguished by a bishop's see, in whose cathedral dedicated to Saint Nicholas lies buried Jacques, the last king of Cyprus. You may read his epitaph on the left of the choir of this church, which says, "To Jacques de Lusignan, King of Jerusalem, Cyprus and Armenia, be praise unstinted for his noble deeds and his triumphs over the enemy." To claim the honors which were refused him, this new Caesar invaded and won the kingdom of Cyprus, took side with the powerful arms of Venice, reduced Amegustus, and united himself in marriage with their daughter Catilina, a very goddess in beauty. A pious, wise, clement, munificent, and magnanimous prince, surpassing all in arms and war. Him savage death struck down on the 13th year of his reign and 34 of his age, and cut off in his cradle his posthumous son, July 6, 1473. Catherine, the Venetian, queen his consort, erected the monument. Francis Vicaria, the servant of Christ, Bishop of Famagusta, composed the epitaph. On a stone behind the altar, you may read these words: Francesco de Prioli, being in command of the Venetian fleet, the banner of St. Mark was happily raised in Cyprus, February 28, 1488. There is another church of no great size called Santa Maria Hydria, in which, on the right hand, is preserved one of those water pots in which was the water which Christ at the marriage of Cana in Galilee turned into wine. It is a large earthen pot, one handle of which is completely torn off, while the other is partially broken. Besides these two is a third, of the Greek church of St. George, in which you see the marble monument of Epiphanios, with a Greek inscription so wasted by age that it cannot be read in its entirety. Somewhere near this church there lived at that time an old man of small stature called Pietro Paolo, who was said to be of the family of the Scaligeri of Verona. At the capture of that city, the Venetians banished him, being yet a boy, to Cyprus, where he was kept for a long time in the castle, but he gained at last leave to wander at his will, but always within the city walls. It had been forbidden him to marry, but by a concubine he begat a son and 2 daughters, whom he married to 2 Belgians. One was a doctor of medicine, the other instructed boys in the liberal arts. Both of these, throughout our stay in Famagusta, did us many kind offices. The annual income of the bishop of this city is reckoned at 3,000 golden ducats. Not far from the city is the site of the old Famagusta or Salamin, in which Paul and Barnabas preached the gospel of Jesus Christ. Some of its ruins can still be seen, as well as a church with the subterranean prison of St. Catherine, which seems to be cut out of rock. On April 8th we left Famagusta, and crossing the very great plains which lies in the middle of the island, bound by a long string of villages and mountains, we arrived in one day's journey at Nicosia. This is a city of some size and beauty, where lives an archbishop whose annual income reaches, so report goes, the sum of 12,000 golden ducats, and most of the nobles of the island. One can make the circuit of the city in an hour and a quarter. In a monastery of the Franciscans, the body of Saint Francis, a Burgundian knight, is shown in a wooden bier. There is another monastery of the same order, in which most of the kings of Cyprus are buried, and right royal are their sepulchres. From the time of the kings of Cyprus, many French nobles lived here, who still preserve the French costume and enjoy many immunities and privileges. They keep their vassals, who are called barici, in the state of slaves. Some of them are born serfs, some of them are born free and sold later for certain duties only. A free woman who marries a slave bears slave children. In the Roman law it is different, for the offspring of a free mother and a servile father is born free. A slave cannot marry the female slave of another master, but the nobles themselves pair off their own serfs, unless, and this is a rare case, a master allows a union with another serf when the children belong to the master of the female slave, that the offspring may follow the womb that bore it. The nobles are greatly given to amusements, especially hunting and hawking, and at certain seasons of the year, at carnival especially, they hold solemn games and banquets with great cost and splendor. In their rules of succession, the eldest brother takes the title and property to the exclusion of his juniors. Nowadays, they mostly marry the daughters of Venetians. At the time we reached the city, the inhabitants were making a great commotion and storming the house of some official because they had discovered that the greatest part of the corn, in which the country abounds, was being sent out of the island, so that bread was lacking for their daily food. At last some of the chief nobles came and with soothing words and promises appeased the rioters. In the cathedral church a certain Venetian lies buried called Carlo Capello. He was remarkable for his knowledge of 3 languages and other attainments, and as he came of one of the first families, he was a man whose wonderful grace of manner made him generally popular. The Venetians set him to rule, as their custom is, for a term of 2 years the island of Crete, then for 3 years that of Cyprus. During his lifetime he ordered this epitaph to be inscribed on his tomb: I, Carlo Capello, Knight of the Republic of Venice and Viceroy of Cyprus, bade this shrine be erected for my body, but that my soul shall fly to God I have desired and believed. Hail, ye chosen of God, and win for me by your prayers his boundless mercy. On April 16, we left Nicosia, and next day reached Limisso, a considerable village, with a sea the income of which is 3,000 ducats, and a castle of which the ruins are visible. On April 25th, 2 hours after sunset, we left the shore of Cyprus in a Venetian vessel, which was reckoned one of the chief and largest of his time, with more than 200 persons in our company, and about noon next day we reached the city of Paphos, where Paul and Barnabas exposed in a marvelous way the fraud and malice of one Elias, and won the proconsul Sergius to Christ. This city also has a bishopric, with an estimated revenue of 3,000 ducats. On May 7th, we left Paphos and 4 days later got into the Atlantic Gulf. The next account belongs to one Fabriano Falchetti, who was taken prisoner at the fall of Nicosia on September 9, 1570. This is believed to be a letter sent to the Doge of Venice, and the account is quite interesting because it's entitled An Account of What Happened at the Taking of Nicosia in Cyprus by the Turks, and it's quite revelatory. He begins, quote, I, Fabriano Falchetti, of Saluderio, a village in the district of Rimini, who happened to be at Nicosia in the company of Captain Palazzo da Fano, can give an account of many things which happened before and after the loss of that city. And I begin and say truly to your Serene Highness, how on the 28th of June the Turkish fleet arrived at the Salines. By common report there were 200 vessels, galleys, galiots, fuste, with other kinds, such as lighters, caramusalini, palancate, and the like, to the number of 200 more. And as soon as they arrived, they sent off 100 other ships to Caramania, to bring other troops, and landed some of their men, and built a few forts, and remained quiet 19 days. It was said on account of a difference between the 2 pashas, Piale wishing first to go to Famagusta, and Mustafa to Nicosia. They resolved, however, at last to go to Nicosia, which they reached in 6 days. When they were within 4 miles, they fell in with 500 stradiots, which were in ambush. These were the balance of the 800 in Famagusta. That is, there were 500 in Nicosia and 300 left in Famagusta. A great skirmish followed, and many were killed. 1 stradiot only fell, and Captain Cortese was made prisoner. We heard afterwards that they cut off his head. When they had pitched their camp about a mile from the city, 300 Italians made a sally and came to blows, without any loss on our side. The enemy, posted behind a hill called Famagosta, began to build their forts, which were 5 in number, facing 5 of the city bastions, and while they were building them, many of their men were slain by our artillery. When the forts were finished, they began to batter the city incessantly with their guns, and while still firing to make trenches which ran from one bastion to another. Then they set to make other winding trenches which sometimes came up to the walls of the city, and again another which girdled all 5 bastions, in which they posted many guns and musketeers, who fired continuously and hindered us from approaching the walls, which were without parapets. Next, they brought up their works in serpentine fashion to our ditch, and there were made 2 parapets, one on the right and the other on the left, and managed so that our artillery could not prevent them coming up to the angles of these bastions, and they did come up and cut off the angles. Meanwhile, our men made 2 sallies by night to find out what they were doing, not without loss on our side and theirs. On the Feast of the Virgin, August 15th, a sally was made to spike their guns, and a fierce skirmish ensued, in which many of the Turks were killed, and 40 of our men, among whom were Captain Giobattista da Fano, Count Alberto Scotto, and Captain Cesare da Treviso, who was a high-ranking lieutenant. After this skirmish, no further sallies were made so as not to lose men. The Turks, meanwhile, set to joining the soil which they dug out of the bastions with other soil which they brought up in front of the ditch, and thus, with fascines and earth they built up a road to the level of the bastions, while we could assail them only with fireworks and stones. Along this road, every day some of them kept suddenly mounting up, and always killed some of our men. When they were now fully furnished with everything necessary for the attack, they ceased firing and came to a parley, demanding the surrender of the city. Report was duly made to the commanders and to the governor Rinconi, and it was determined to give no ear to their proposals but to treat them as enemies. A few days later, on the morning of Saturday, September 9th, as reveille was sounded, and they were already on the walls, having climbed up quietly in the night along the roads they had made without being discovered by our soldiers, and attacked us so suddenly that we could offer little resistance to their first charge. But our troops retired to a shelter constructed by Captain Palazzo, where they met the enemy gallantly. And there the Turks would have not got no further into the city, had it not been that while we were fighting there burst on our flank a great band of the enemy, who were understood to have entered by another bastion. They killed very many of our men, among whom were the commander, his brother, and Captain Palazzo. No resistance was possible, and one fled here, another there. I got safe with 25 of my company to the square of the Salines, where was gathered a large band of nobles. We made a stand, and when the chiefs on horseback with the bishop and many others. Here we made a fresh stand, but lost ground and retreated to the palace of Signor Dandolo, where we found himself and the bishop. The gates were bolted, and when the Turks were for charging at them, we told them from the windows that we surrendered. They would not consent, but the lieutenant, Signor Dandolo, set free a Turk whom he had taken prisoner, and sent him to tell the Pasha that we surrendered all our forces, and bid him order his men not to kill us. The Pasha sent a note to the Janissary, who was said to take us prisoners. They set to killing and haling us away, and in their onslaught Signor Dandolo was killed, and the bishop made prisoner with many others. I had been on the bastion Podocataro, where our standard-bearer had lost his ensign, which I recovered. I was in all the fights mentioned above, and was at last made prisoner by a Turk, who led me to a pavilion, where 3 days later I was sold for 16 sequins to a renegade, who carried me off to the fleet and set me on a galley, where I lay chained for 20 days. Unquote. And so ends the account of Falchetti, who was actually lucky enough in the end to return to Italy. Many thousands from Cyprus would not be so lucky. This concludes the end of the first part of this broader episode, and it revealed through the accounts of Elias of Pesaro, Christopher Furer, and Falchetti that Cyprus, with the exception of Famagusta, was in a state of socio-economic turmoil which facilitated the following Ottoman conquest. In the next episode, in part 2, I will discuss about the accounts of Giovanni Sosomeno, engineer during the siege of Nicosia, Giacomo Diedo, Venetian historian in the 18th century who wrote about Venetian Cyprus and its demise, and parts of Paolo Paruta's account on the loss of Cyprus. I hope you enjoyed this second episode of the podcast, and wish for you to stay tuned for what's to come next on the Wonders History podcast.